Throughout the 60s and 70s, the quest for authentic rebellion continued. Each new subculture pushed harder at the boundaries of the acceptable, provoking a succession of moral panics about the state of youth in Britain. By the mid-80s, it seemed that the boundaries could be pushed no further, but a completely new and puzzling form of subculture was emerging, involving many more young people than ever before.
The government's considering giving local councils new powers to control acid house parties. They'd include the jailing of organisers of unlicensed parties and confiscating their profits.
Acid house parties have become, in the Home Secretary's words, a nuisance to many and more than a nuisance to some. The Surrey police would certainly endorse that view. On Saturday night, several policemen were hurt as they tried unsuccessfully to stop a party going ahead near Reigate. The Chief Constable is determined that won't happen again.
Well, the danger is people think that they're just cosy parties for youngsters, which they're not. We seized almost 2 dustbins full of drugs and offensive weapons last weekend, so one has to see them in that sort of perspective.
Senior policemen would like the law strengthened to compel organisers to obtain licences and give advance notice under the Public Order Act. Offenders should get stiffer fines or even prison sentences.
All the ingredients there of a classic moral panic. But by now the term is being used much more widely than by social scientists, as a young sociologist from Canada observed. Like Stan Cohen, Sarah Thornton came to the UK to complete her postgraduate studies.
I arrived in this country to do my PhD in September 1988. I was planning to write about clubs. But the day I arrived was a day in which The Sun had Acid House on its front cover. Oh, this is what I've come to study. There was a lot of hype around the scene, but I was still quite shocked when I went to my first Acid House club. I really did feel like an anthropologist because although the music travels, you know, it's easy to send a record across the Atlantic, the dance styles are very local, and I couldn't believe acid house dancing. And certainly I'd heard a lot of the tracks, but never experienced the whole environment. Acid house was a term coined on the back of a compilation album. And that album cover also contained a blurb that predicted moral panic. And interestingly, you see that issue picked up by the music press as they're reviewing this album. Eventually, it was self-fulfilling. And really, that's a marketing man's dream. The term moral panic was being used by clubbers, by ravers. It was used in fanzines and the style press, like The Face and ID, and the music press, like the New Musical Express. It was a term being used over and over again to identify this phenomenon. And what they meant more loosely than the academic or sociological definitions of the term was that there was a kind of media hysteria, a lot of sensational reporting. The general consensus seemed to be that this was thrilling and really a guarantee of the credibility of this culture. You know, it made this huge culture something, that it was being covered by newspapers like The Sun. The tabloids seemed to fluctuate between positive and negative coverage of acid house and then rave. Initially, The Sun had, you know, guides of how to dress in authentic acid house gear. But then not more really than 2 or 3 weeks later, they were absolutely scandalized by the drug taking that was taking place at these kinds of events. And in general, youth are much happier with negative, scandalized, hysterical coverage than they are with positive coverage. It makes youthful activity important beyond the bounds of a regular Saturday night out.
It also, in classic terms, provoked a response from the authorities. Something had to be done. The Criminal Justice Act of 1994 sought, among many other provisions, to clamp down on illegal raves. For the first time, there was an attempt to define a musical form in order to criminalise it.
It's affecting my generation a lot more than any other piece of legislation they've ever tried to pass, because the great majority of the population don't understand what it means, and it doesn't mean anything to them.
It seems like this particular bill has almost politicised young people and got them more involved, and really it's something that, because it's a basic affront on their freedom, and raving and youth, that is so much part of youth culture, that they've actually, you know, snapping and saying, you know, what the hell's going on?
10 people have been arrested in central London after violence broke out during a march in protest against the new criminal justice bill.
The Downing Street gates became a focus as 3 times they withstood human battering rams that shook the very posts.
After the breakup of the demonstration, thousands of young people stayed behind, dancing and playing music. In Hyde Park, they were told to move, and confrontation with the police quickly followed. A number of people were arrested and several were hurt.
But the dancing went on. A new generation of clubs and licensed outdoor events attracted tens of thousands of young people. Rave was becoming the mainstream.
I can safely say that it's totally different to any nightclub or any such a similar event where alcohol was available. The threat of violence just wasn't there. There was no fear of anybody setting about each other or anything like that, which you always have. In fact, in some occasions you can actually taste it in the air that there is going to be trouble. But I can honestly say that that wasn't the case. People went there just to enjoy themselves, and by goodness they certainly did that, the majority of them.
We don't need that anymore.
By 1995, we're seeing the emergence of an unprecedented youth cultural revolution in this country. We're seeing a mainstreaming of dance culture. In every high street, in every town, in every city in Britain, there are clubs that are now playing dance music weekend in, weekend out. What's also mainstreaming quite rapidly is the fact that because it's now being played on Radio 1, because it's now on top of the pops, we're beginning to see the images beginning to blur between a straightforward youth culture and a drug-related youth culture. We're seeing the mainstreaming of drug culture in this country in a way that we haven't seen it before. And irrespective of all the messages that are going out, we're seeing the emergence of what some people have called an E-generation or a chemical generation that doesn't have a problem with drug taking.